Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Managing Human Rights and Avoiding Non-Compliance in the Supply Chain. So we start a bit late there, just let the final people join. So as the title suggests, we'll be addressing the issue or multiple issues surrounding the management of human rights in the supply chain. I'm delighted to be joined today by Steve Kenzie and Colleen Theron. Steve is Executive Director of the UN Global Compact UK network, who are a catalyst for companies to align their strategies and operations with universal principles on human rights, labour, environment and anti-corruption. Colleen is Director of Ardea International, who specialise in sustainability, business and human rights, and she also has 25 years experience as a solicitor. So, just to take you through, there we go, the format for today, the agenda. We're going to have Steve introducing human rights issues to you and the work that UNGC are doing. Colleen will take you through human rights legislation, and I'll take you through the supply chain data story, from engaging your own organisation to engaging your suppliers. Steve will round up and we'll have time for question and answers and discussion. So just on that, if you want to pose any questions to us or indeed leave any feedback, then simply enter your question in the appropriate box on the webinar control panel. Hopefully it looks similar to that picture we're showing you there. And don't worry, if we don't get to your question, we'll try our best, but if we don't, we'll respond to all questions individually offline. And we'll provide the slides to everyone after the webinar as well. So without any further delay, I'm just going to pass over control to Steve here, and he'll be able to introduce you to the human rights issues and the work that UNGC are doing around that.
Thanks very much, Giles. And I'm just, there we go. Can you confirm that you are seeing the right screen now for me, Giles?
Yes, that looks great. Thanks, Steve. That looks good.
Excellent. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I noticed from the registration list that quite a few of the companies that have registered are not are Global Compact signatories. So I thought I would take the liberty of just going for a few minutes, a couple of slides just to give you a bit of background on Global Compact before we talk about human rights. So it all started in 2000 when Kofi Annan spoke at Davos, and he said he proposed that business leaders and the United Nations initiate a global compact of shared values and principles which will give a human face to the global market. And of course, this was coming off the back of, the challenges in the 90s around globalization and a recognition that globalization wouldn't work for anyone if it didn't work for everyone, and a need really for companies to perhaps be a little bit more guided by values, and the UN had really a ready set of universal values that could be applied. So at the core of Global Compact are 10 principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And these principles are all drawn from UN treaties that have been ratified around the world. This is tremendously powerful for companies whose supply chains now extend into sometimes very challenging markets. And certainly, some of the conventional views around corporate responsibility it could be perceived as a Western or a Northern agenda rather than a global agenda. And really the strength of our principles is that it debunks that. These are global, truly global. The human rights principles were derived from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, labor from the ILO guidelines, the environment principles from the Earth Summit Charter, and so on. So they really do have provide a very robust foundation. Global Compact itself is many things. A leadership platform. To become a signatory requires a commitment from a company CEO. We're looking for a willingness to engage in continuous improvement. So that commitment, needs to be there. We don't need companies to already be good. We want to work with all companies to improve performance. So we just need that genuine commitment, an openness to dialogue and to learning. And we offer opportunities for that both at the local and global levels, and a commitment to transparency. So on some level, the Global Compact is a reporting initiative as well, as all participants are required to communicate annually on the progress that they're making. Global Compact is the largest corporate sustainability initiative around the world. In fact, these numbers I think might be even a bit out of date. So at least 12,800 signatories around the world, and I think it might be over 13,000 now, in 160 countries, and there are 70 or more than 70 local networks such as ours here in the UK around the whole world, and that's what that map is showing. And as you can see, certainly Europe and North and South America and most of Asia very well represented by these local networks. We work across a wide range of issues, a wide range of platforms, numerous opportunities and areas for engagement. We're particularly interested in the SDGs, and at the moment, certainly for the year ahead, human rights. Now, that was a very fast tour, so definitely happy to take questions on Global Compact later or offline. Do please get in touch if you'd like to know more. Today's theme, though, human rights, and it certainly is an important area for us. And the idea of human rights is pretty simple, really. People have a right to be treated with dignity. And that was really first, captured and codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is 70 years old this year. And so you'll probably be seeing more references to it as the year goes on. It was proclaimed by the UN General Assembly in 1948. It's been translated into 439 different dialects, and it is binding on all UN member states. So again, this is something when you have a challenging supplier in a challenging market that says, they don't do human rights. Well, here's your answer. Yes, they do. There are a wide range of human rights that are impacted by business. I won't read all of these out, but many of them are obvious, right to work and freedom of association, equality at work, equal pay for equal work. Some perhaps a little bit less immediately obvious, like a right to rest and leisure and a right to a family life. All of these rights are codified in the UNHDR. Other rights impacted by business, though not necessarily relating to labor, but clearly you can see the knock-on effects of your activities in any commercial environment, and how it can affect your workers, your customers, the people that live in the communities around your operations. And it is essential, really, that companies have an eye on this. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were created to provide a framework and a better understanding for companies and their responsibilities. And this is all developed by John Ruggie, and he came up with a really brilliant protect, respect, and remedy framework. Governments and states have an obligation to protect the human rights of their citizens. Companies have an obligation to respect the human rights, and where there has been an abuse of human rights, then all parties have an obligation to provide a remedy. And so really for the first time, this document spelled out really quite clearly for companies what was expected of them. And that really leads us to the topic of today's webinar. How do you as a company know that you are respecting human rights through your supply chain? What mechanisms have you got in place to understand your impacts and identify them, remedy them, and so forth? And so I'm going to say thanks at this point and pass back to Giles, and we can get into some of the substance of that question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Steve, for setting the scene there. That was great. We're now going to pass over to Colleen, who will take us through some of the human rights risks to businesses and some of the legislation or increasing legislation globally that we're coming across.
Thank you, Giles, and hello everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today, and Steve for your introduction, which I think flows really well into what I'm going to cover. So I'm conscious of time and conscious that I have quite a lot in my slides to talk about. So hopefully what I will be able to leave you with are some really key points about the nature of human rights risk, this sort of snapshot on legal landscape, and really to consider how you might avoid some non-compliance in your supply chains. Just briefly before I start, I just thought I would give you a snapshot of the kind of companies and organizations we've worked with. As Giles said, I'm a lawyer and founder of Ardea, and we are a specialist sustainability, business and human rights consultancy with expertise in modern slavery. So as I said, how takeaways for today, looking at the nature of the risk, I want to give you a snapshot of the legal landscape because I think that will help you to understand what your compliance obligations and reporting obligations are, and then some thoughts about how to avoid non-compliance. Just before I start, we thought it would be really helpful to understand from those of you who are participating what your single biggest challenge in 2018 is. So, Giles, we're just going to have a poll. So if you can look at the questions, I think your ability to vote is on your dashboard. We'll just give you a minute to answer these questions. I see all the information is coming through now. Okay, so the statistics are changing as I'm looking at them. All right, I don't know if you can share that, those findings. Can you, Giles? Okay, 25%. Right, that's really interesting. So for the majority of you listening today, maintaining sustainable corporate governance is what's really key. And I think that's really helpful for us to know because, I mean, interestingly, we asked this question to a different audience last year where I was looking particularly at issues around legal compliance. And what came out of that poll was that actually ensuring that a team is compliant and interestingly, managing the impact of the political uncertainty was at a very different level of percentage than what's come through here today. So I think for those of you listening and having had a look at the kind of roles that you represent, it seems to me that it goes without saying that the landscape of managing a business responsibly is being affected by a number of factors. One of them being the increase in regulation, but alongside that, we're looking at reputation management, risk management, and the fact that business costs are being squeezed at the same time that managing your supply chain is becoming a really critical issue. We're also seeing that mainstream investors are recognizing that environmental social governance issues are really critical differentiators with companies. And I also wanted to just highlight in a sort of scene setting around compliance, the fact that we're living in such a different era. We are increasingly exposed to a requirement for greater transparency. There's more litigation. The fact that we have social media platforms that disseminate news, bad news particularly, really quickly, is a really big element in business having to consider this issue of compliance and non-compliance in its business as well as in its supply chains. And I've highlighted consumer-facing issues as a question mark. The reason I put a question mark in there is because I've found that speaking across a number of businesses, that the consumer pressure is not always something that's making people change. It really does depend on the sector and the business. So what do we mean by human rights risk? I think, Steve, it was really helpful having the introduction about the fact that everyone has a right to be treated properly and decently. And when we talk about human rights risk to business, it's really the risk of impacting human rights of individuals, and it refers potentially to the impact or the potential of adverse impacts that a company can have on the enjoyment of human rights. And this has become a massive issue as the power and the extent of influence of multinational companies have increased. So as we know, human rights have generally been or protected at international level from a legal perspective and at national level. But what we have is not always the kind of legislation that can bring companies to act in a really responsible way, and that has led to a governance gap in relation to how they behave and how one stops negative behavior around human rights. So we know that if companies find themselves in a position where things have gone wrong, the impact tends to be along three areas. It's legal and operational and reputational impact. And the consequences of things like legal risk are legal fines, claims by third parties, breach of penalties, loss of income, and then the cost of achieving compliance. And I think what is interesting recently, in a few weeks ago, I don't know if you saw it, but a company which has not been disclosed, the name of the company has not been disclosed, has had to pay $2.3 million in compensation to a union for failure to rectify human rights and health and safety impacts in Bangladesh. And there's an issue around transparency there, which would be quite interesting to explore perhaps at the end of this session. And, you know, the company actually being protected through the arbitration. So what kind of trends are we seeing in human rights in business? Now, I wanted to highlight these because I think that by understanding these significant trends and how they might impact your business, it's going to give you an insight as to what is important around compliance and what kind of steps you can take in addressing potential non-compliance of human rights risk in your business. So we have seen a tremendous growth in mandatory reporting instruments globally. For those of you that want to know a bit more about this, I would recommend looking at the Carrots and Sticks report, which has shown that there's been an over 100% increase in a rise in mandatory reporting instruments across the globe. And alongside this shift, we've seen a shift towards domestic legislation, where many countries are beginning to legislate on how companies should be behaving in relation to potential human rights risk and modern slavery issues. And I'll come on to that in the next slide. We've also seen a shift in transnational activities being anchored into activities of third-party suppliers. And this, of course, has the growth in these activities has kind of gone alongside also standards not being applied in a very standardized manner, with much more ad hoc application of standards and weak incentives to change behavior. We also see that governments are demanding more information and that investors and customers are looking for more information. So, you know, we have on the one side much greater requirements around reporting, but less enforcement, weak incentive to change behavior. And of course, all of that is going to give rise to a risk in supply chains and a risk in breach to human rights and a growth in human rights risks, which companies need to be much more aware of. So my next few slides, I thought I'd just give you a snapshot on the kind of reporting requirements that exist in the UK and globally. This is just a snapshot of what exists currently in the UK. I think what is important is perhaps to think about what is required under the disclosure requirements for these particular pieces of legislation. Because what we are also seeing is a change in the way that the legislation is asking businesses to report. So with the Companies Act in 2006, there was just requirements to give information around environmental risk and social risk, with not much said about the company's policies that sit behind it. But this has changed when you look at the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive, you look at the strategic reporting regulations. There is a definite shift towards companies now having to provide information more around their policies and their due diligence framework to support the policies that they have in place. In the US, we have growth in anti-trafficking legislation. We have the Frank-Dodd Act. I think if anybody's following what's happening with the Trump administration, we see that there is some erosion around Frank-Dodd, which has been causing some consternation. Whether or not he's going to try and retract any of Obama's initiatives around trafficking waits to be seen. For those of you who haven't come across the French law, the vigilance law, again, this is something that came into force last year. Companies having to show and take steps to prevent infringements of human rights. It affects bigger companies, but again, what's really interesting in this piece of legislation is, again, the shift towards companies actually having proper due diligence systems in place and not just a policy where companies can point to it but not have anything robust sitting behind it. And again, we are seeing a growth around mandatory disclosure on how companies are addressing a modern slavery risk. And Australia have now come up with recommendations around a proposal for a Modern Slavery Act, which has been accepted. There is potentially going to be different enforcement requirements in Australia versus what we have in the UK, based on the inquiry procedure and the recommendations that were put to them from lots of different global organizations. Canada is currently consulting around a Modern Slavery Act. New Zealand have shown some interest, but I heard last week that Nigeria and Kenya are also now busy looking at this kind of legislation. I think the one cautionary note I want to just raise around this is that there is a potential for a lot of companies having to really think about how they will manage this disclosure legislation if they are global, and if in fact each country is going to adopt a different iteration of this kind of reporting. I would have hoped that actually at some point from an international perspective, there would be a push to try and get some synergy, because when companies are faced with having to report on so many different issues in different places, what that tends to lead to is confusion, or people being caught up in a resource of just simply reporting and not actually managing to do and implement changes in the business. So I have alluded to this already. I've spoken about the fact that what we're seeing is this growth in due diligence and companies being asked to report on their policies and the frameworks they rely on, companies having to identify deficiencies in their supply chain and to prevent potential violations against their own sustainability goals. And I'm sure that what Giles is going to have to say is going to fit really neatly into this, because one of the key issues around providing information is and identifying deficiencies is actually having an understanding of A, what your impacts are, and B, what data there is available to be able to disclose what is going on in your organization and your supply chain. So I want to pause just for 1 second, because we have another poll, and the question that we are putting to you is whether or not you are in any way tracking your suppliers' compliance. And I should have said compliance around business and human rights, because of course there's compliance on anti-bribery, compliance and environmental impact. So let's have a look. Interesting. So some of the answers are still coming in. Okay, so that's very interesting, because the majority of you have said actually you're not really sure, but there's a higher percentage that have said yes than no. So that, I think, is quite revealing again about you as participants and the kind of roles that you're playing. Is that definitely more of an understanding around tracking suppliers' compliance in this area than perhaps if I had asked this question 6 months ago, which I did to a different audience, and again, I had a completely different answer. So that's very helpful. Thank you. So really looking then at the kind of key issue of today, and, you know, how do we manage non-compliance? What does it mean? And I think really the reason I've spoken about how you report and the legislation around disclosure is that for you to really manage non-compliance, you first of all have to understand your compliance obligations. And I know that sounds really obvious, but actually in a legislative framework, a global legislative framework that keeps changing, I think that in itself is a real significant challenge. It's just understanding where you operate and what are the legal requirements in those particular jurisdictions about human rights and business and disclosure and modern slavery. So the first thing I would say you really need to do is get a grip of what those compliance obligations are. The second issue around managing non-compliance is really understanding your impact. And that sounds really obvious, but I've worked with lots of different organizations where that initial step of understanding your impact has not always been done in a very strategic manner. And where strategically a company does map its impact, whether that's on an environmental basis or on a human rights basis, it very often flags up issues which you might not have thought about before if you hadn't undertaken that kind of really logistical analysis to get an understanding of what your impacts are. And then another slightly more obvious point it may be, but it's how do you build your due diligence processes? And how do you do that? And one of the suggestions I've made is obviously to look towards the voluntary reporting frameworks like the UNGPs, the UN Global Compact, because they have very robust information about what a due diligence process looks like, what should be put in place, talking about leverage and complicity, the kind of things that as a business, if you are a global business, and actually even if you are a small business, you need to think about is what is your influence and what is the opportunity to influence change where there is a potential human rights risk. The OECD guidelines are very chunky. They're quite difficult sometimes to get a hold of, but if you don't know where to start, it might be something that you can go and look at depending on your sector. Some really good sector guidance from the OECD that is useful in building these processes. But the other thing I've highlighted here is this question of reputation. What are we talking about in beyond compliance? Because I think that's really key in this agenda, is that we're not just talking about managing non-compliance of legal non-compliance, because that's too easy to then become a tick box exercise, but really looking at reputation. What is it beyond compliance that we're talking about? So I don't really want to go into this. You'll be getting a copy of the slides, but this is really about Principle 17 and the concept of due diligence, creating a shared language, and what companies should be doing to really ensure that they have a proper system in place to address their adverse human rights impacts. So I just recommend you have a look at that afterwards. And then to sum up, what should companies be doing? Now, I've already touched on that in relation to managing non-compliance. I've spoken about understanding what your compliance obligations are and understanding your impacts. But I actually think that for a lot of organizations, it might be just actually also getting the executive and the board to determine the approach, because very often there can be this kind of execution gap where either the board decides they really want to push forward on something, but they don't operationally think about how they're going to manage or to do that, or I've found lots of operational people really keen to do something and trying then to work out how they get the board engaged. So top level board engagement is really key, and for them also to determine the approach and the resources that will go into this. I also think for companies it's helpful to benchmark their current performance. So really understanding where they are, taking a good look at where you are and where you want to be. So a gap analysis around your current performance and where you want to be in the future. I've spoken about mapping supply chain impacts. I think developing a responsible business program is absolutely key. For more and more organizations, we're beginning to see an embracing of this talk about responsible business as opposed to just CSR. I think that probably we'll see more of that in the next few years, and linking between environmental and human rights impacts. Publishing policies is critical, including protections in your contract terms, and of course, establishing this robust supply chain diligence and processes. And I've put at the back end to educate, because I think that without awareness raising and really educating those people in the company that are at the front end of having to make decisions around human rights impacts and modern slavery impacts, you can't really move forward. There really needs to be that kind of understanding of how a particular person in their own role can play a role in mitigating the risk of negative impacts. So I absolutely cantered through a lot of information. I hope that what I've said and what I've shown you today at least gives you a feel of what potentially are the risks in relation to human rights, what is the global legal landscape and how that's changing, and then more particularly, what is it that you can do as a company to start addressing these points. So I'm just going to go back to Giles and look forward to listening to what he's going to tell us now.
Thank you very much indeed, Colleen. That was a great overview of human rights risk to businesses and legislation and the regulatory landscape that we find ourselves in. I think a large amount of what you've highlighted there shows the responsibility that organizations have to tackle the supply chain, but also perhaps how many different approaches there are to doing that. So what I will go through now for the next few minutes is some guidance on how you can begin to tackle the supply chain issue, both in relation to human rights and beyond. So I've broken this down into three quite broad segments, and that is engaging your own organization, engaging the suppliers, and then how to manage the wealth of data that hopefully you've then gathered. So we call this the data story. And I guess the reason that Greenstone has so much insight into this area is because we've been making sense of large amounts of data for the past decade. Historically, this has been identifying, capturing, calculating organizations' data across multiple streams, which then enables those organizations to display and report their non-financial data appropriately. However, as we've seen, as Colleen's been discussing, there's been a trend for organizations to be required to and to start looking beyond themselves and begin to engage with their supply chains. So this creates a number of organizational and data challenges, which I'll try and break down for you now. So before we begin to look specifically at the challenges and the issues that should be addressed when engaging your suppliers, First, I think we must look at the ways in which you can prepare your own organizations for that process. So suppliers need to be engaged, assessed and influenced, but first, so does your own organization. So what you'll find when trying to engage externally is that there are many different drivers, responsibilities, and indeed actors. So what I tried to do here is to break these down into manageable areas that can be assessed. And as you work through them, you'll see that many of the key issues are naturally intertwined across the organization and the people within it. So firstly, one of the most important things to think about is who are the stakeholders that are driving this action, who will be affected by it, and who needs to be involved. So we have investors, regulatory bodies, customers, for example. Depending on the type of organization, all of these could need to be taken into consideration when you think about how you need to display, report, or gather your supply chain information, or indeed what that information might be at all. The legislation and frameworks that Colleen has already touched on obviously shape the type of information that you'll need to gather. But having said that, this will also be defined by the types of suppliers you use and the products or service you are providing. Now, risk and compliance has obviously become a big driver for engaging with your suppliers, but it too is influenced by many other factors. Compliance, for example, as we can see here, could be defined by industry or product or supplier-specific requirements. And the resultant risks that need to be mitigated through robust processes might be reputational, as Colleen's touched on, or even continued supply issues. So lastly, we can see that there will be internal stakeholders and current practices that will need to be identified, reviewed, and aligned with any new processes moving forward. But one of the most important aspects of any change is that it's communicated. So when reviewing these systems and management of supplier relationships, I think all relevant departments and individuals should be included in the process. Often the information being gathered and the relationships being leveraged and even the resources being provided or consumed sit across the business. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight for the different areas of the business and the different types of things that you need to touch on. The diagram there might not be entirely accurate for everyone, but hopefully gives you a good indication of how to break down your overall goals. So what we'll do now is just drill into the external challenge that addressing your supply chain naturally encompasses. So if we look into this into a bit more detail, what I've done here is to take all the external aspects and frame them as questions that you could perhaps address. So again, the focus today is naturally human rights. However, from our perspective of engaging with your supply chain, we see human rights information as one of multiple reasons for engaging your suppliers. For some organizations, it could be the most important driver of the program. For others, it may form a much smaller part of a wider compliance program. It doesn't matter where the emphasis lies, though. I think, or we see the challenges as being very similar. So here we've got a number of questions to address, and hopefully, if you do that, then you'll be in a stronger position to implement an effective supply chain solution. So again, as before, there are many different elements here, and what you'll notice is that they're kind of intrinsically linked together, but we have tried to split them up. So two of the obvious key issues to look at are who are my suppliers and what information do I need from them? For example, is there legislation that needs to be satisfied? Are there industry-specific compliance requirements? Or do I need to gather supporting evidence? Once you've identified the information requirements that are driving your supply chain program, the manner of supplier engagement or the specific information required will in turn be influenced by the makeup of your suppliers. For example, the category, geography, and spend with a supplier could inform what self-assessment questionnaires you distribute to them, what documentation is required from them, or indeed how you actually engage with them, such as self-assessment, audit, site visits, or a combination of all of them. This is often termed, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with it, a risk-based approach to supplier engagement. And your decisions are defined by the supporting information that you can provide on your suppliers, and indeed what information you want to gather. So just to move on to some of the other key areas, things like the resource and utilizing the data. For example, should this be an outsourced program from an administrative perspective? I guess practically you may have trained procurement or sustainability professionals working on this, and it could be considered a waste of resources for them to be carrying out administrative tasks. So rather, from a review and management perspective, they and other departments should be involved in using and interpreting the data, not just doing the administrative legwork. So finally, I put in the top left there multiple tiers as a question to address. Now, depending on your industry, this is something that can be important in achieving not only traceability, but the compliance and the transparency required to be able to satisfy your key stakeholders, such as customers. And I think that ties in with what Colleen was talking to earlier. This is an area where software solutions can really help, but at the same time, you still need to work to define the clear requirements, understand your influence over the supply chain, and to ensure all of this is communicated effectively to suppliers at all levels or all tiers. So software can help you with all of this in different ways, and it's definitely a question that comes up again and again and needs to be considered when you're devising these programs. Great. So I hope that helped in terms of breaking down the different challenges, both at an organizational level and indeed at a supply chain level. Having addressed those key questions and defined the strategy for engaging both of those levels, I guess the big question is, how do you gather the data from your suppliers and how do you utilize that data now that you have it? So we've created some simple tips here that are always worth bearing in mind when setting up your programs and indeed reviewing as they evolve over time, which they certainly will. So just to run through these very quickly before I hand back to Steve to tie up and we look at some of the questions you put in. Firstly, defining your supplier assessment levels. So not everyone needs to be assessed to the same extent, and we've got some examples of the different levels there, but the idea is that you should maximize the coverage across your supply chain. And then using automated analysis tools, again, this comes back to maximizing resource, but it enables you to identify risks, create comparable metrics, and then compare across that data efficiently. Then maintaining up-to-date information. This is vital and often overlooked. So what the situation that organizations are often in initially is that data is being collected at tender stage or contracting, but not on an ongoing basis. So that's something that needs to be remedied. Then we've got something that sounds very, very simple, but don't bite off more than you can chew. So don't gather what you don't use. Only gather the data that you're going to use. Do you need the evidence? Do you have escalation processes that result from non-compliance, for example? You can always build up that data set. Second last here, we've got integrate with internal databases and systems. So I guess the message here is don't repeat what's already being done. There's a lot of good work going on out there, and you can tie your programs into those other programs that are going on. And then finally, to wrap up, if possible, it's great to have all of your information consolidated in one environment. So again, this comes back to software in some instances, but not necessarily. Depends on your situation. But to have all of that data in one place rather than disparate is certainly an advantage from an organizational perspective. So we'll share that with you in due course, and I'll hand back to Steve now. Well, I won't hand back the slides, Steve, but if you can just draw that all together for us, that would be wonderful, and then we can look at some of the questions that have come in.
Thanks very much, Giles. Thanks also, Colleen. That's all very interesting. I think that last slide was particularly helpful to focus in on a few key areas. The picture that's come out of this for me is just what a complex challenge this is, and so I think the need to simplify and focus in on what's most material is really imperative. Colleen's point, that wishful thinking perhaps, that all of the various pending national legislation coming together on modern slavery, that great hope that be aligned. We do need to hope so, and this ability to link systems into external systems is going to be tremendously valuable. One point I think that's particularly key from Colleen's presentation was the idea about reputational risk and going beyond compliance, because I think it's quite true that the legal risks and sometimes the legal penalties around non-compliances may not be that severe, but the implications for reputation and the potential costs in lost business as a result of non-compliances, could really make those actual formal penalties look pretty small indeed. So I think it really is key to keep an eye on non-compliances and looking at the big picture and the implications there. I think for me that last slide was really key from yours, Giles, that those key areas to keep in mind. So I certainly urge everyone to do that assessment of your current data collection protocols and review and start getting things in line and making sure that it is in fact fit for purpose. So Giles, do we have some questions? I'm not seeing them on my screen, but
yeah, we have them on our screen here as the main organizer, Steve.
Yes, okay.
Brilliant. Okay, well, Colleen, thanks for that, and to Steve. We've got a few questions that have come in here, but I might kick off with one myself, which might be a bit controversial given the title of our presentation being all around compliance. But I was wondering if human rights is something that we should be talking about in compliance terms, or should the terminology be more collaborative and aimed at ensuring best practice and therefore best possible results, which could potentially involve compliance failures, which we learn from, rather than driving compliance down people's throats.
Do you want to answer that, Steve, or shall I comment and you come in?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, because actually, when you talk about compliance and non-compliance in an environmental framework, it's much easier to think of it in relation to licenses and permits, and you either have a license and with conditions or you don't. And it's very different when it comes to human rights and business, where it's not a question of you necessarily being issued with a permit, but you have this idea of a social license to operate, and that's very much more around best practice procedures, as you say, and actually collaboration. I do think, though, that some of the issues that we might face in the kind of extent of negative impacts on human rights is probably driven by the fact that it isn't a compliance issue insofar as there's no potential director's liability in some instances, or there isn't enforcement penalties, which does translate in cases where business isn't concerned about its social license to operate or its reputational management, but they just don't care.
Great. Steve, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think for me, I would frame it in a sense of, in any issue like this, there will be leaders and laggards, and we need different approaches to improve performance at either end of the spectrum. So the leaders, it's going to be more about dialogue and that desire to go beyond compliance anyway. They're already beyond compliance. But for the laggards, if they haven't already found a reputational or just sort of moral case for managing these issues, then there needs to be a stick. And so I think we need that compliance orientation at the laggard end of the scale to provide motivation that those companies seemingly haven't been able to find on their own. And at the other end of the scale, where there is already that motivation, then a more collaborative approach is going to bring greater gains.
Great. No, that makes perfect sense to me. And I think, yeah, if I was to respond on that, I'd have something similar to you there, Steve. And it's what we've seen in the sustainability world as well, is that compliance represents a very basic level, but companies that are acting on these issues generally go far above and beyond that basic compliance. And I guess what actually that ties into that is a question we have here. And I think it's from Colleen's slides, but it ties into that, which is saying, you mentioned legal, operational, and reputational risks. Which would you say is most important, and therefore which lever should we pull to drive the most effective action? So I guess that's saying we've got those three areas of risk. Is one more important than the other? And if so, is that the button we should be pushing to get the most action globally on human rights?
That's a really interesting question. Again, it would also be useful to hear what Steve thinks. But I mean, it's difficult to answer, because if you have a blatant non-compliance, so a legal consequence that is not being met, a complete breach where the impact is huge and there's going to be fines. In reality, the company is going to have to deal with that first, no matter what happens, to try and, mitigate what the issues are. My own sense is that you actually have to look at all of these things in the round, because each one will impact the other. So a good example was what happened with Rana Plaza. When Rana Plaza happened and a lot of the brands were caught up in that, there was the huge issue around reputation. But actually, the fallout from that was both operational and legal. Firstly, on an operational perspective, there must have been thousands and thousands of orders that just couldn't be met. And that would have meant the brands would have to go somewhere else to suddenly get what they needed in stock. But the legal impact has been just as big. We've seen a number of civil claims being brought by victims against business for failure to protect workers, really. I'm not sure if I've answered that entirely in respect of how the question was written, but I think that what I see is all three really are knitted together, and actually for companies they should be considering all the impacts together.
Okay, we've got a couple more minutes. Thanks for that, Colleen. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think they're so deeply intertwined, and each one will have a different impact on different organisations. We've got a couple more minutes, and there's a couple of questions directly for you, Steve, here on the UN Global Compact. We've got one that says, what happens if companies don't provide an updated communication on progress? Do you know?
Sure, that's an easy one. They will switch from being active status to non-communicating status, which is happens in the public domain. So on the Global Compact website, they will be branded a non-communicator, and they will be able to remain as such for a year if they don't get around to it. But after a year, they'll be expelled.
Okay.
So there is a grace period, and it's quite accommodating. If as sometimes happens, changes in personnel lead to breakdown in communication. So perhaps a company only discovers, that the COP is due with only a few weeks before the deadline. We certainly want to work with participants to resolve those kind of issues. But yes, eventually, if a company fails to communicate, they will be expelled.
Wow, sounds dramatic. Lastly, before we finish, we've got one more for you, Steve, which is just around support from the UNGC. So for companies that are beginning their journey around addressing human rights issues, what kind of support can they expect from the UN Global Compact?
That's going to come in at different levels. Certainly, there's a number of there are resources available on the Global Compact website, and so sorry that I didn't have a slide on that to share in the presentation, but I did send one around, so hopefully we can incorporate that into the slides we share. But easy to find on the Global Compact website, links to some of the past work that's been done and how Global Compact links into the guiding principles. At the UK level, we have a couple of different working groups looking at one on modern slavery, looking at decent work in global supply chains, looking at diversity and inclusion. We organize events over the course of the year, things like this, but also face-to-face to create opportunities for people to discuss the challenges around managing human rights in supply chains across a range of different sectors. And certainly we feel that's often where useful innovation will come from, hearing how people in other sectors are facing up to these challenges.
Okay, so plenty to get your teeth stuck into if needs be on the UNGC website, and obviously that goes the same for Ardea. If you want any advice, then please get in touch with Colleen. And that just leaves me to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you for listening. I really hope that has provided some useful insights and some practical guidance on what you can and perhaps should be doing on the issue of human rights for your organizations. That's the reason we put the webinars on, and I hope you've derived some benefit. We'll share the slides with you, and I think we'll share the recording as well, to those that want it. You're more than welcome. So thank you very much indeed, Colleen, and thank you very much as well, Steve.
My pleasure. Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Lovely. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.